I have to I want to start talking about a poet, a Scottish poet, very famous Scottish poet, a man called Robbie Burns. You've probably heard of him, Pat. One or two Scots people have. He said some pretty good words. And in preparing for being here at this moment, I'm reminded of the words, "The best laid plans of me some men so oft can go astray." With all the best intentions, sometimes things don't come together as you want them to. That's certainly the case for standing here in front of you at this moment. I was debating on Monday what I was going to preach, whether I was going to go into this story, which is called The Little Apocalypse, for obvious reasons that will come up, or do a farewell service to Semesi. And spread my wisdom of 35 years of being a minister and talk about the depths of culture, which I decided to do. About 2 o'clock yesterday afternoon, all of that unravelled as Semesi's not going to be here, and I hardly think there is any point in giving him my pearls of wisdom about ministry for the future when he's not here. Exercise in futility. So I am back with The Little Apocalypse, although perhaps there is something in today that really is special about this passage, because as I was driving yesterday to come here, a little later than I anticipated for the garage sale, but nevertheless I think it was about just after 9, and I turned the radio on and I'd heard the news coming out of Paris. And you've heard the terrible news that has happened. Devastating news, and news that just doesn't affect people there. It reverberates from all good people who want to go about a peaceful and ordinary life. When terror comes, it's a very difficult thing to deal with. I can remember the planes going into the Twin Towers as a very real memory. I can remember sitting with leaders of the Uniting Church after a big meeting and hearing the stories of bombs going off in London and buses being ripped apart by bombs. And I asked myself, where is the humanity in all of this? Is this how we treat each other? And which person can claim the right of God to kill other people in God's name, whether we call that name Christ, whether we call that name Allah, or whatever we do? Because I don't think that any side in itself has any claim on God. God is. So I was devastated with this, and yet reading our passage today, a very deep and serious passage. This isn't just something to be glossed over. This talks about wars, rumours of wars, famine, the very thing that breaks up life, the very thing that disturbs the fabric of who we are as society and community. And if you don't think that what happened yesterday in Paris has some impact on the community we are so far away here in Melbourne, then we are sadly mistaken. Which of us now can take for granted just a trip into the city, or just going about our business? We never know. And for most part here, we live in peace and we live with a lot of security around us, don't we? It is a pretty good place to live. Some of you come from areas and places which are not had such a great history. For you who are from the South Sudan and suffered civil war, where these sorts of things are very real, these traumas, these breaking down of humanity's responsibility to other humanity. People from Cambodia who will have seen the killing fields and lived through the killing fields. In some respects, I stand here and say, what right do I even have to start to talk of some of this trauma? Many of you people have lived through some of these things. People who come from Sri Lanka, who sit here, who've seen the devastation that's come between the Tamil and the Sinhalese. And our inhumanity is really torn apart. We live in a sad world, true? Some of you would have grown up and known of wars, world wars. My mum always says, look, don't worry, I survived the war. And whereas I laugh because she was only a child, she did survive the mass bombings of London, where in her street 1 in 3 houses was destroyed. This is real stuff, isn't it, when you talk about these things? When we talk about Cambodia, when we talk about South Sudan, when we talk about these happenings that when we turn our television on can seem remote. And yet, what is that to do with our faith here today? Firstly, let me say, the tendency to throw blame on innocent people, to say all Muslims are like this because a few people act wrong. There is a history throughout faith of people taking God's name and profaning it and to turning it into something it shouldn't in the claim to be supporting that faith. Many of us have sat alongside people of other faiths and realise that they are not inhuman. They are just like you and I, the same aspirations, the same desires. And it's so easy to be waylaid and blame everyone and put some kind of blanket on other people and say this type of person is bad. Because even in the days of Jesus, there were some pretty tough things going on. We can get into some very deep discussion of whether Jesus was being prophetic or whether this was written after the fact that the temple had been destroyed. As you know, there was a great temple in Jerusalem that was destroyed after a civil war or a war against Romans by the Jewish people. It's called the Jewish Revolt. As far as wars go, it wasn't a very powerful war. Lots of Jews got killed, a few Romans, and the temple was turned over, and there was the start of the exile of the Jews after that. But we cannot read this passage without realise that this had actually gone on, and the readers of this would have been very well aware of this trauma that happened. There is no society in human history that hasn't known war or conflict in some form or another. Do famines and storms happen throughout the world? All of the time. There is not one thing that is spoken of in this passage here today that we are not familiar with in our own time either. So what do we do with it? How do we then cope with this? How do we take it away? And what is Jesus trying to say to his disciples when he talks about these things? Because we are confronted with difficult situations, good and bad. They may not be war, but still, we are still confronted with difficult times, aren't we? Each one of us, at some stage upon our lives. And if we don't think that Jesus is interested in the tough stuff, then we've got it wrong. There are some forms of the Christian faith that just want to see Jesus as a party boy and a good time. And you know, everything's swimmingly great. But it appears to me as I read through the 4 Gospels that the times of Jesus were tough, were difficult and confronting. You know, Jesus didn't end up on a cross without reason. There is a reason why Jesus ended up, and it is not to fulfill some unpleasant God's desire to kill his own son. It is because of the way that Jesus spoke, because of the way that Jesus lived, and the way that Jesus reacted to people of power. Because I can tell you one thing, even to this very day, if you say nasty things to powerful people, bad things will happen to you. True? People who've got power don't like it taken away. They don't like to be questioned about it. I'm also mindful today as I speak about this, we can talk about 110, 120 people who were killed in Paris. Very few of us will speak of the 115 that got killed in Syria this week. There is a saying that Western human life is worth far more than people from Asia or Africa or other places. You know, I don't know what's happening in the Sudan, but I'm sure the trouble still is going on, even as we speak. True?
Well, actually, there is peace.
There is peace.
So the opposition, I think from Monday, the delegation of the opposition are going back to capital of South Sudan, Juba.
Mm.
So to put this in implementation, so to enact mission. And as we know also the country, the divided, they should promote from 10 states to 28 states. So they're waiting for them to go and put the things in order.
So hopefully there's some good signs on the horizon. Well, gee, isn't that good? Because there's been more than enough indiscriminate killing amongst people for culture. And let me say, I don't think culture is a bad thing. I am proud of who I am and where I come from. Certainly there are people from my background, from the English colonial times, who did terrible things. But does that mean that I should be ashamed of all that I am? Not at all. And I asked you to take the good things of your cultures and hold fast to those things, because much of it is good. It is only when it pits us against other people to exploit and take away that perhaps we should start to question what we do. I stand here in Australia because of what the English did here. Did they do bad things? You betcha. But did they do some good things? They did. You know, we live in a good country, don't we? We have a relatively fair system of governance. There are a lot worse places to live. And so what I'm trying to say to here is culture is something to do with this. But when it gets out of kilter, when it goes wrong, it can go sadly wrong. And so how does Jesus respond to those things? Is Jesus indifferent? At home by my seat, I have a belt buckle, which is from the First World War. That was about 100 years ago, for those of us who can't remember. I wasn't there at the time. I'm pretty sure none of you were. But on my belt buckle, it's got the words, and George over here and I were having a discussion yesterday, because if Sir Messi had been here, I would have started preaching in German for you. But it says the words, Gott mit uns. What does that mean, George? God with us. So the Germans felt in the First World War that God was with them. He was on their side. Trouble is, my grandfather, who fought for the British Army, also thought that God was on their side. And in many of the wars, especially the Western wars, God has blessed cannons on both sides. It's crazy, isn't it? This was brought home to me. As you're aware, last week we had Thursday Remembrance Day, yeah? Can I tell you a little story about this? Which I was watching a show called Blackadder, which is a comedy show, but it was set in World War I. And I was watching this on Wednesday night. And I thought, somewhere in this house I have got my grandfather's medals. And I haven't seen them since we've moved in. Have you ever done that? Put boxes which you're going to get round to opening and you never do? So madly about 10 o'clock I was ripping open boxes that hadn't been opened in about 10 years since I've moved into the house where I now live. And there I found this little tin box that I'd proudly brought over from England a number of years ago, and in this box contained 2 First World War medals. I've got to say, my grandfather was no hero. He didn't have any Bronze Stars or didn't have any Victoria Crosses or military medals. He was just an ordinary soldier. But these 2 medals, for me, were the one thing that I'd ask him as a small child. When he died, which was a terrible thing to say, I'm sure, when he died, can I have your medals, Grandad? And so therefore, on the 10th, I found them. And I thought, what I'm going to do is give these medals to my daughter. And I'm going to let her take them to school to show them on Remembrance Day. Not to glorify war, but to say war is about ordinary people. I then became aware it was actually 40 years ago to the day, on the 11th, that my grandfather passed away. So there was something a bit spooky going on for me there. So I was pretty excited about this, and I'd found alongside of this some family trees, and for whatever reason I like my family tree. I like to know that I come from very ordinary folk who didn't do too many extraordinary things. It puts my life back into some kind of perspective. And I found these medals and I was so pleased, and I put them by the side of the table to give them to Eleanor. Eleanor is an early riser. About 5:45 she was playing in there, and I thought, I'd better get myself up and I'll show her these medals. And she was overwhelmed to see these medals. She thought, this is fantastic. These go back 100 years ago. And she wanted to take them to school. And perhaps the most poignant thing is, as she left, she held the medals in her hand, waiting to go with a sack on her back that was about 3 times bigger than her, as these little kids often have, all dressed up ready for school. And she said, one thing I want to ask you, Papa, which side do I support? Mama's German and you're English. I think there was a depth to that question that I sort of hadn't even realised. You know, it's been a significant period of time since the Second World War, which actually brought Irene's family out here after the conclusion of the Second World War, when they became displaced people from their country. I think another word for it is asylum seekers, but they came out and sought asylum. My grandfather, the man who owned those medals, I think would have turned in his grave to know that I'd married a German. He used to say to me these words, there's only one good German, and that's a dead one. Interestingly, her grandfather used to say there's only one good kind of Englishman, and that's a dead one. Isn't it funny how countries that can be such bitter enemies, and then, you know, a generation later, we're marrying each other, we're doing what we do. What does that say about the human condition? This literature we have today, this apocalyptical literature, is a certain type of literature, and I ask you to take it for that. It is like a psalm. What is a psalm? A psalm is like a song or a poem, isn't it? And the Bible is filled with different kinds of literature. The New Testament is filled with different kinds of literature. Literature that is prophetic, literature that is didactic. That means it is teaching, and it's there to teach us as disciples. But there's some parts of it that are there to just show us the way that things are in some kind of genre. And this genre is apocalyptical literature. You can see it in the Old Testament in books like Daniel, and you can see it in the New Testament in our reading today. Interestingly enough, we'll look at the Luke's version in 2 weeks' time. The first week of Advent looks at Luke's version of the little or the small apocalypse. But it talks of a time when things are tough. The church in its early days, let me tell you, was not the church like it is today, where we can freely meet, that we can come together, and yeah, the world might think we're a bit odd, you know, these strange people that go to church. For the people that met in those times, it was a church under persecution, with wars and rumours of wars going on all around them. What is being said here today is, no matter what, these things will happen. These things will come upon every generation. But simply, through all of this, God is. God is. The most simple thing to say of it all. This is very real for me, because while I was in Germany, the last few times I've gone to concentration camps, a cassette lager, just outside of Berlin, literally 20 minutes outside in the suburbs, there is a concentration camp where people were exterminated for the simple fact that they were different to the others. They were Jewish, they were gypsies, they were Slavic people, or dare say they were communists, even their own. Ideologically driven by race and driven by hatred. And the biggest challenge to my personal faith was the first time I walked into Sachsenhausen and walked through the gates where it says those terrifying word, Arbeit macht frei, work makes you free, knowing clearly that there was a systematic way of killing people that were different from us. And that challenged me deeply. How could God exist beyond this? But to read this today tells me that no matter what we think, no matter what we experience, no matter how life might treat us, simply this: God is. A more accurate statement I couldn't say. So whatever trials that you and I might go through, whatever difficulties confront us, these words are simple. For you today, for me today, God is. Vive la France. Thank you.